Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Eiffel, I want to come to you because I'm very concerned about what I saw in Georgia. It seemed like there was a lot of chaos there. People were blaming it on high turnout. I would hope we would not consider high turnout a problem. That's what we're seeking. But today I've heard a lot of criticism of vote by mail. And is vote by mail uniquely susceptible to fraud?
Not particularly, Representative Raskin, and I think it's really quite alarming just hearing the conversation in which we have talked about money, we've talked about how much things might cost, we've talked about fraud, and we actually have not really focused, at least in terms of hearing the Secretaries of State of two states with which I'm in litigation at the moment, talk about people, and particularly talk about the large African-American populations in each of their states who are susceptible to COVID, and particularly African-Americans who suffer from pre-existing health conditions and disabled populations in their states. And we really haven't heard either secretary address what that means and what it means for those voters. So when we talk about these absentee convictions that Secretary Merrill's talking about, 6 convictions, he says, and I don't know the nature of those, but that is actually very few, as has been pointed out, in comparison to votes cast. And both of the secretaries have talked about how few in their states tend to vote absentee. We're here having this conversation because we're in the midst of a global pandemic. Many more people will want to vote absentee. And we saw that in Georgia. We saw how many people didn't receive the ballot. We saw how many people came out to vote but found that their polling places were changed. We understand, as we heard earlier from Representative Loudermilk, that many people who work in polling places are elderly and therefore will call out and won't want to work on Election Day and expose themselves to COVID. And I haven't heard what are the comprehensive plans to deal with that and to protect the population that is most vulnerable and who want to participate fully in the political process. Identifying 6 voter fraud convictions over a number of years simply doesn't cancel that out.
So I understand that voter registration rates have plummeted because of COVID-19. I consider that really alarming. What can be done to deal with that problem?
Yeah, so first of all, I also want to correct the record because Secretary Merrill talked about the increase in voter registrations in the state of Alabama. I just want to point, and he also talked about the federal role. I do want to point out that the state of Alabama had to enter into memorandums of agreement with both the Department of Justice and with the NAACP in 2014 and 2015 for their failure to comply with registration provisions in the National Voter Registration Act. This is exactly why you need civil rights litigation. This is why you need the federal authority. And so to the extent they're touting those numbers, we should be very clear that it required intervention to make sure that in public benefits offices and in the DMV, they were doing the registration that they need to do. We need more online registration. We don't want people to have to engage in person in any of these offices if they don't have to, and especially if they are disabled, and especially if they are particularly vulnerable to COVID infection. And so we want to increase the possibility of people being able to register online. We want to increase the possibility of people being able to absentee vote. We want to increase the possibility of them being able to absentee vote without having to engage in physical contact with a notary. We have elderly people who are separated from their children. Their children don't want to come see them because they want to make sure that they're safe, and yet they have to have 2 witnesses sign their absentee ballot in Alabama, 1 witness in Louisiana.
I want to shift to Kristen Clark. Ms. Clark, it's at the heart of American self-understanding that we believe in the right of every citizen to vote and to have his or her vote counted and to be part of self-government through the system of elections. And yet at the same time, when you look at it historically, there has always been tremendous opposition and resistance to letting everybody vote. And there have been a whole series of very fancy rationales put up to explain why you really need to own property in order to vote, so you're invested in the community, or you really need to achieve certain levels of literacy before you could vote, or you needed to live in a certain place long enough before you could vote. How do you explain this paradox that we believe very strongly in the right to vote, and yet there are always people ginning up some justification for trying to keep other people from casting their ballots?
Yeah, I have to say that the opposition that we're seeing to absentee balloting is illogical and difficult to understand because this has been a feature of our voting system that extends back to the 1800s. when people in the military were allowed to vote by mail. We send ballots overseas to those serving the United States proudly. We send ballots overseas to citizens who may be living temporarily abroad without issue or without concerns about fraud. So we can send ballots down the street to ensure that people during the middle of a global pandemic that's impacting Americans from every corner, but disproportionately people of color, we can send ballots down the street to ensure that they have voice this season.
I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very